What happens when a CEO realizes that his company's success isn't truly because of him? What if the very foundation of his empire was built by someone unseen, someone unnoticed, someone who never asked for recognition? Jackson Harmon, the 47-year-old founder of Harmonics Learning, was about to find out. He had built his company from the ground up, guided it through years of growth, and celebrated its steady rise. But recently something felt wrong. Despite the upward trajectory, a sense of dissatisfaction lingered. Morale was slipping. Employee turnover was creeping up. The reports from HR were vague, and leadership feedback no longer painted the rosy picture he was used to. With the numbers no longer telling the full story, Jackson did what most would never dare. He decided to go undercover. Disguised as Jack Morris, a new hire from the QA support team in Denver, Jackson joined his employees on a company retreat far away from the polished boardrooms and financial reports. This wasn't about publicity. It wasn't for TV. It was personal. Jackson wanted to understand why, despite everything, the company felt off. What was going wrong behind the scenes that he wasn't seeing from the top? He was about to discover something far more profound than he ever imagined. And it wasn't a crack in the system. It was a revelation about the hidden heroes of his company, those who held it together while the corporate machine hummed on. And in the process, he'd find himself questioning everything he thought he knew about leadership. Sitting quietly at a long dinner table with over 100 employees at Timberstone Lodge, Jackson overheard a conversation that pierced straight through the guise he had carefully built. A voice, loud and confident, cut through the chatter. "He's just a paycheck. Without me, this place would have gone up in flames." Those words weren't aimed at him directly, but they were close enough. Jackson couldn't help but listen as Dylan Croft, a team lead in product strategy, basked in the self-glory of his own importance. The other employees nodded, agreeing with him, all while Jackson sat in his hoodie, unnoticed. Dylan didn't know it, but Jackson was right there in the room, hearing this confident claim. It wasn't just arrogance. It was a symptom of something deeper. The lack of true leadership, the disconnect between the people doing the real work and those being celebrated in boardrooms. As the evening unfolded, the name Linda was casually tossed around. "If Linda quits, I'm out," murmured a young employee. It was a comment that stuck in Jackson's mind. Linda. No one had mentioned her in any of the company's reports, and yet she seemed to be a pivotal figure, the one holding everything together. It was a name that didn't appear in titles, in memos, or in leadership meetings. Yet, she was the reason people stayed. As the CEO, Jackson had never even heard of Linda. And that realization shook him. What had he missed? Who had been quietly leading his company when he was too busy chasing numbers and profits? The night went on, but Jackson couldn't shake the questions that were rising within him. If Linda was the real leader here, what had he been doing all these years? If the company was truly still standing because of her, then how many other unseen leaders were quietly holding the pieces together? That night, Jackson began to uncover something more than cracks in the system. He discovered the unseen leadership that had been keeping his company from falling apart. It wasn't the loud voices or the titles. It was the quiet heroes like Linda and Marcia. Leaders without titles, but with the power to move mountains. And with this discovery, everything was about to change. The cold winter air wrapped itself around the Timberstone Lodge, where the annual company retreat for Harmonics Learning was taking place. A rustic, picturesque setting, nestled among towering pines and blanketed in freshly fallen snow, Timberstone was meant to be a place for employees to unwind, recharge, and build camaraderie. Yet there was something brewing beneath the surface, an undercurrent of unease that Jackson Harmon, the CEO, had felt creeping through his company for months. Jackson had come to the retreat not as the CEO, but as Jack Morris, a new hire from the QA support team. The idea was simple. Get away from the corporate spotlight, put on a disguise, and blend in with the employees to understand what was really going on in the company. This wasn't about flashy cameras or promotional stunts. It was about learning the truth, something far deeper than what metrics or board meetings could reveal. Timberstone Lodge buzzed with conversation as employees settled into the dining hall for their first dinner of the retreat. The clink of silverware, the warm laughter, and the lively chatter filled the space, masking the underlying tension Jackson had hoped to uncover. He was seated near the end of the long wooden table, his hoodie damp from the snow outside, his baseball cap pulled low over his face. To anyone watching, he was just another weary tech worker from one of Harmonic's smaller satellite offices. But beneath that simple disguise, he was Jackson Harmon, CEO of the company, and he was here to listen. The first revelation came before the main course had even arrived. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans were being served when a loud, confident voice rose from a few seats away. Dylan Croft, a mid-40s team lead in product strategy, was in the middle of a boastful tirade. "Without me, this place would have gone up in flames years ago," Dylan declared, stabbing his fork into the chicken with an exaggerated flourish. The table erupted in laughter, but Jackson's focus was entirely on the man. Dylan wasn't just making a casual remark. He was positioning himself as the undisputed hero of the company. A few employees nodded, smirking, while others raised their glasses in mock agreement. Jackson didn't turn to look at Dylan right away. He didn't need to. He had already done his homework. He knew who Dylan was. He had picked up the name during the welcome activities earlier that day. Dylan Croft, team lead in product strategy, a man who was loud, charismatic, and seemingly full of himself. But what Jackson didn't expect was the way the employees seemed to hang on Dylan's every word. He wasn't just the loudest voice, he was the one everyone seemed to listen to. And that bothered Jackson. He had always believed that leadership came from the top, that success was built on metrics and hard numbers. But this didn't fit the narrative he had built in his mind. As Dylan continued his boast, Jackson's thoughts began to wander. "The suits up top don't even know what we do day to day," Dylan added, taking another swipe at the higher-ups. "If it weren't for Linda and a few of us who actually give a damn, this place would have folded like a cheap deck chair." Linda. The name floated through Jackson's mind, lingering like an unanswered question. Who was this Linda? And why was she, someone apparently so vital to the company, never mentioned in any of the leadership reports or meetings? Dylan was rewriting the story of the company in real time, but no one had ever brought up Linda. Not once. Jackson scribbled the name down in his crumpled notepad. Linda. He made a note to find out more. From across the room, a younger employee, perhaps 22 or 23 years old, murmured to their colleague, "He's not wrong, though. If Linda quits, I'm out." The comment stuck in Jackson's mind. If this Linda was the key to the company's success, then why hadn't anyone in leadership ever brought her name up? Why wasn't she in any of the reports, on any of the innovation teams? Why was she so crucial to the company's survival, yet completely invisible in the world of senior management? Jackson was beginning to understand something that was slowly becoming clearer with each passing minute. The loudest voices weren't always the ones that mattered most. Dylan's ego and arrogance were undeniable, but Jackson realized that something much more powerful was lurking beneath the surface. The real leadership, the one that kept the company going when no one was looking, was quiet, unnoticed, and uncelebrated. Later that night, the retreat activities continued, but Jackson's mind was racing. He had come here to uncover the cracks in the system, but what he had discovered was far more profound. It wasn't a breakdown in the company's structure, it was a breakdown in the company's culture. It was the unseen, unacknowledged leaders who were holding everything together, people like Linda, and now someone else was beginning to take shape in Jackson's mind. The next day, during a team bonding exercise, Jackson's attention shifted again. The retreat had assigned employees to various groups to tackle a challenge that involved building shelters out of basic materials. Dylan, as usual, took center stage, talking a big game about strategic tarp placement and the best ways to construct a shelter. But Jackson wasn't focused on him anymore. His eyes were drawn to a woman walking into the activity area with a thermos in one hand and a battered canvas tote slung over her shoulder. Her name tag read, Marcia Q. Marcia Quinn. She wasn't loud. She didn't demand attention. She didn't have a title, at least not one that screamed leader. But Jackson could see it almost immediately. She was the glue holding this team together. While Dylan was busy performing and giving grand speeches, Marcia was quietly solving problems. When a box tipped over, she was the first to crouch down and restack the ropes. When someone dropped a glove in the snow, she was there, picking it up and handing it back without a word of complaint. She wasn't looking for recognition. She was just doing what needed to be done. The more Jackson watched, the more he noticed something remarkable. People weren't flocking to Dylan. They were gravitating toward Marcia, drawn to her quiet competence, her steady presence, and her willingness to help. It wasn't about titles or positions. It was about trust. And Marcia had earned that trust, not through flashy gestures or loud proclamations, but through the quiet strength that came from years of doing the work that no one else noticed. Jackson began to realize that there was a stark contrast between Marcia and Dylan. Dylan was all about the spotlight, the loud voice, the bravado. Marcia, on the other hand, was the one who made everything run smoothly behind the scenes. She didn't need to be in the spotlight. She didn't need anyone to tell her she was a leader. She simply led by example. As the day wore on, Jackson's thoughts turned to Linda once more. He had heard the whispers about her, how she was the reason some employees stayed, how they couldn't imagine the company without her. But Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that Linda wasn't the only one. There were others, too, quiet, humble leaders like Marcia, who had never been given the recognition they deserved. That night, Jackson found himself alone in the lodge's library, sifting through old company files on his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keys, but his mind kept wandering back to the retreat, to the conversations he had overheard, to the people who had shown him a truth he had never considered. What if he had been wrong all along? What if success wasn't about the loudest voices in the room, but about the quiet ones who were always there, holding everything together? The next day, Jackson knew he had to confront this new reality. He wasn't sure how, or when, or even if he would make the changes necessary to shift the culture at Harmonics. But one thing was certain. His eyes had been opened to a truth that was impossible to ignore. Leadership wasn't about titles. It wasn't about ego. And it certainly wasn't about numbers. It was about trust. It was about people. And it was about those who worked quietly in the background to keep everything intact when the rest of the world had moved on. And now Jackson Harmon was beginning to see them, not just as employees, but as the true lifeblood of his company. As Jackson spent more time undercover, he began to realize that the success of Harmonics Learning was not solely dependent on his corporate vision or the loud voices of executives like Dylan Croft. Instead, it was the quiet, unseen leadership of people like Marcia Quinn, who had no title, no recognition, but was the very backbone of the company that truly made Harmonics what it was. It was the simple human acts of care and connection that held the company together. In a world obsessed with profit margins and data, Jackson was beginning to see something far more valuable. Leadership that didn't ask for recognition, but that everyone depended on nonetheless. The first time Jackson saw Marcia in action, he knew something had shifted. The retreat had thrown people into various challenges designed to build team spirit, but it was clear that while others were focused on strategy, Marcia was focused on the people. Her ability to handle crises, to step in without hesitation, and to quietly resolve problems had left a lasting impression on Jackson. When the team-building exercise broke down into chaos, Dylan had been quick to bark orders and assume the role of a leader, loudly proclaiming how he was the only one who knew what to do. But when the team's shelter began to collapse under the weight of a sudden gust of wind, it was Marcia who had calmly and decisively stepped in, adjusting the structure and saving the whole team from failure. No one had asked her to do it, and no one had expected her to, but she did it anyway. It wasn't about credit. It was about doing what needed to be done. Jackson had watched as people gravitated toward Marcia, seeking her guidance, not because she demanded attention, but because they trusted her. And in that moment, Jackson realized something profound. Leadership wasn't about standing in the spotlight. It was about stepping in when things went wrong, offering support when it was needed most, and doing it without a desire for recognition. Marcia's impact extended far beyond that one moment. As Jackson observed her over the next few days, he saw her as the company's true pillar. During the retreat, she was the one who stepped in to help colleagues with small tasks that were often overlooked, whether it was offering a warm smile to someone feeling overwhelmed or lending a hand when a team member was struggling. Marcia didn't demand acknowledgement. She didn't need anyone to praise her for her efforts. Instead, she led by example, creating a sense of unity and stability that others could rely on, even if they didn't always recognize it at the time. As Jackson continued his undercover investigation, he realized just how vital Marcia's quiet leadership was to Harmonic's success. Without her, the company might have faltered. She wasn't a CEO or a VP. She didn't have the flashy title or the big paycheck. But she was the person everyone turned to when things got tough, the one who made sure everything stayed together when the cracks started to show. It was her steady, reliable presence that gave the employees the confidence to keep pushing forward, even when the work seemed overwhelming or the future uncertain. The contrast between Dylan and Marcia. As Jackson's observations deepened, the contrast between Marcia and Dylan became even more apparent. Dylan Croft, the loud and boastful team lead, had made it clear to anyone within earshot that he saw himself as the company's most essential player. His arrogance and self-importance permeated everything he did. He was always the first to speak in meetings, the first to raise his voice in group settings, and the first to remind everyone how much he did for Harmonix. He was the embodiment of traditional leadership, loud, bold, and impossible to ignore. But as Jackson began to look past Dylan's bravado and focus on the real dynamics within the company, he realized that Dylan's leadership was hollow. His focus was on self-promotion, not the well-being of his team. Dylan's increasing arrogance became more apparent during the retreat. As the days wore on, it became clear that Dylan wasn't interested in truly listening to his team members or supporting them in meaningful ways. He often dismissed their concerns, brushed aside their ideas, and undermined anyone who didn't fall in line with his vision of leadership. His confidence was rooted not in his abilities, but in his loudness, his dominance in conversation, and his refusal to acknowledge anyone else as a valuable contributor. On the other hand, Marcia had no need to shout about her contributions. Her actions spoke louder than words. While Dylan was busy stroking his own ego, Marcia was quietly holding the company together. When the team faced challenges, Marcia was the one who showed up with solutions, offering calm, steady leadership when it was most needed. Unlike Dylan, she didn't need anyone to tell her she was important. She knew that the real value of leadership lay in helping others, supporting them through difficult times, and creating a culture where people felt safe and valued. Jackson noticed the subtle but powerful way Marcia was able to lead. She didn't raise her voice or seek attention. Instead, she moved quietly among her colleagues, always present, always engaged. Her leadership was felt in the way people looked to her for guidance, even if they didn't always understand why. It was the kind of leadership that was rooted in empathy, trust, and a genuine desire to help others succeed. And as Jackson watched this dynamic unfold, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of discomfort. He had spent years building his company on metrics, on numbers, on data, on profitability. He had created a structure where success was measured by quarterly earnings and market share, where leadership was defined by titles and visibility. But now he was realizing that these things didn't capture the essence of true leadership. Marcia was showing him a different kind of leadership, one that wasn't about ego, one that wasn't about being seen, but about being there when it mattered most. And in that realization, Jackson found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about business. Jackson's internal conflict. As the days went on, Jackson's internal conflict grew. He had come to the retreat with one objective: to uncover the cracks in his company's system and figure out what had gone wrong. He expected to find issues with the structure, with the metrics, with the financials, but what he found instead was a culture of neglect. A culture where the true leaders, the ones who made the company function on a day-to-day basis, were invisible to the corporate hierarchy. They were the ones who held everything together, not with grand gestures or flashy performances, but with quiet dedication and a commitment to others. Jackson's transformation was starting to take shape. He had always been a detached CEO, viewing his company from a high-level perspective, focused on profits and growth. But as he spent more time observing Marcia and other employees, he began to understand the deeper layers of leadership that were hidden beneath the surface. It wasn't about profit margins or growth charts. It was about people. It was about how leaders made others feel, how they empowered those around them to do their best work, and how they created a culture of trust and collaboration. As Jackson began to grapple with these realizations, he felt a growing sense of unease. For years, he had been blind to the true nature of his company. He had focused so much on the bottom line that he had forgotten about the human element that made it all possible. His employees weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were people with dreams, with struggles, with stories. And Jackson had ignored them. Marcia, who had been quietly supporting the company for years, was the embodiment of everything Jackson had overlooked. She wasn't looking for praise, and she wasn't seeking power, but her impact on the company was undeniable. She was the one who kept the company's values alive when the executives were too busy chasing growth to notice. And now, Jackson had come to see that the true heart of Harmonics wasn't in the boardroom. It was in the people who showed up every day, not for recognition, but because they cared. Marcia's role unveiled. The more Jackson observed Marcia, the more he learned about her history at Harmonics. She had been with the company for decades, and during that time, she had quietly become the glue that held everything together. She had no official title, no corporate accolades, but she had been there from the beginning, supporting and protecting the company's culture in ways no one had ever acknowledged. Jackson was shocked to learn that Marcia had been an integral part of Harmonic's success long before he had even joined the company. Despite not holding a leadership position, she had earned the respect of her colleagues by always being there when they needed her, whether it was for professional support or personal guidance. Her loyalty to the company was unwavering, and her integrity was the foundation upon which Harmonics had been built. Through conversations with younger employees, Jackson began to uncover just how much Marcia had impacted their lives. They spoke about how Marcia had saved them during difficult times, whether by offering a listening ear when they were struggling with personal issues or by providing the practical support they needed to succeed in their roles. One employee even mentioned that Marcia had been the reason they stayed with the company after a particularly tough year when they were ready to quit. Marcia had seen potential in them when no one else did and had offered them the support they needed to get back on their feet. It was clear to Jackson that Marcia was much more than just an employee. She was the true heart of the company. And as he reflected on everything he had witnessed, he realized that it was time for him to make a change. The company needed to recognize the unsung heroes like Marcia, to honor the quiet leaders who had been carrying the weight of the company on their shoulders for so long. As the days of the retreat drew to a close, Jackson knew that his journey of self-discovery was only just beginning. What he had learned about the unseen leadership within his company had changed him forever. But it was clear that there was more work to be done, and the real transformation was yet to come. As Jackson Harmon continued his undercover investigation into Harmonic's learning, his eyes were being opened in ways that he never expected. The retreat had not only given him insights into the company's hidden leadership, but had also revealed something much deeper, something that, as a CEO, he had been blind to for far too long. He had come to realize that the true foundation of the company wasn't built on profit margins or growth charts, but on the quiet, unseen leadership of people like Marcia Quinn. This realization marked the beginning of Jackson's transformation as a leader. Confrontation with Dylan noticed. The tension between Dylan and Jackson had been brewing ever since Jackson had overheard Dylan's arrogant comments during the retreat. Dylan had positioned himself as the company's savior, boasting about how he was the reason Harmonics had thrived, and that without him, the company would have collapsed long ago. His loud voice, his self-assured attitude, and his disregard for the people around him painted a picture of leadership that was shallow, egotistical, and unsustainable. The turning point came after a team-building activity on the final day of the retreat. As the group dispersed, Jackson found himself alone with Dylan in a quiet corner of the lodge. Dylan was still basking in the success of the retreat, bragging about how well he had led the team through the various challenges. He spoke with the same sense of entitlement, claiming that the company owed him for all the work he had put in. Dylan's lack of humility was glaring, and it became increasingly clear to Jackson that this kind of leadership was not what the company needed to survive in the long run. It was self-serving, driven by ego, rather than the collective good of the employees. "Jackson, you've seen the team in action," Dylan said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I'm the reason we even have a functioning team here. I'm the one keeping everything together. If it weren't for me, we'd be lost." Jackson had heard enough. The words stung, not because Dylan was wrong, but because he was entirely wrong about what leadership meant. Jackson had spent years building the company on numbers and metrics, but he had never fully understood the value of the people who made up the company. And now, standing there, listening to Dylan's boastful claims, Jackson realized that the most important leaders weren't the ones with the loudest voices or the most impressive titles. It was the quiet, selfless leaders, the ones who worked behind the scenes, supporting their colleagues and doing what was necessary without ever seeking credit, were the true backbone of the company. "Dylan," Jackson said calmly, his voice steady but firm, "it's not about who talks the loudest or who gets the most credit. It's about who shows up when things get tough. And right now, it's clear to me that you're not the one keeping this company afloat. You're part of the problem." Dylan's face turned red, and for a moment Jackson saw a flicker of anger in his eyes. But he didn't react. He simply stood there, allowing the words to settle between them. "It's people like Marcia," Jackson continued, "who make this company work. People who show up every day, do the hard work, and never expect anything in return. It's time for you to realize that your way of leading isn't sustainable. You're not the answer here." Dylan opened his mouth to protest, but Jackson cut him off. "I don't want to hear it, Dylan. You've had your time to speak. Now it's time for you to listen." With that, Jackson turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Dylan standing there, fuming. Jackson's recognition of true leadership. As Jackson reflected on his confrontation with Dylan, he couldn't shake the growing realization that he had been blind to the true essence of leadership for far too long. For years, he had viewed his company through the lens of profitability and metrics. Success to him had been about growth, revenue, and market share. But now, as he observed people like Marcia, who led quietly, without fanfare, and without the desire for recognition, he began to see the flaws in his previous understanding of leadership. In Marcia, Jackson saw a leader who didn't need to shout to be heard. She didn't demand respect, she earned it. She didn't care about titles or promotions. She cared about the well-being of the people around her. And in doing so, she created a culture of trust, empathy, and mutual support. The employees didn't follow Marcia because they had to. They followed her because they wanted to. She made them feel seen, heard, and valued, something Jackson realized he had neglected to do for his own employees. Jackson's admiration for Marcia deepened as he continued to witness her quiet leadership in action. She was always the first to step in when something needed to be done, but she never sought recognition. She had been with the company for decades, and throughout that time, she had become the glue that held everything together. Marcia had supported countless employees through difficult times, offering not just practical solutions, but emotional support as well. She was the one people turned to when they needed guidance, and she was the one who helped them pick up the pieces when things fell apart. But despite her significant contributions, Marcia had never been formally recognized for her leadership. No one in the executive team had ever acknowledged her role in the company's success. Instead, they focused on the metrics, the numbers that reflected the company's growth, but failed to capture the human element that made it all possible. Jackson realized that he had been guilty of this too. He had spent years looking at reports and charts, measuring success by profits and growth. But what he had missed was the human side of the business, the employees who had poured their hearts and souls into the company, the ones who had made it thrive even when the corporate system failed to recognize their efforts. It was time for a change. The revelation to the board. Returning to the boardroom was a pivotal moment for Jackson. He had spent years standing at the front of the room, presenting reports, growth projections, and profit margins. The board had always listened intently to his numbers, nodding in approval as Jackson laid out his vision for the future of harmonics learning. But today was different. Today, Jackson was going to show the board a side of the company they had never seen before. As he entered the boardroom, Jackson could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't about metrics. This wasn't about numbers. It was about the human side of leadership, the people who made harmonics successful, not because they were the loudest or the most visible, but because they were the ones who showed up every day, doing the work that no one else saw. "Good morning," Jackson began, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "I've been thinking a lot about what makes this company great, and I've come to a realization that I think we've all overlooked." He paused, letting the room settle. "It's not about the numbers. It's about the people who make those numbers possible. And one person in particular has been the real reason this company is still standing." The board members exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of where Jackson was headed. Jackson pulled up a slide on the screen, a simple image of Marcia Quinn working with the team during the retreat. No graphs, no pie charts, just a candid moment captured in time. "This is Marcia Quinn," Jackson continued, his voice steady. "She's been with this company for decades, quietly supporting and protecting its culture. She's not a VP, she doesn't have a fancy title, but she's the reason this company hasn't fallen apart." The room fell silent. Jackson could feel the board members' eyes on him, their disbelief palpable. "We've spent so much time focusing on the numbers that we've forgotten the people who are actually making those numbers happen," he said, his tone growing more passionate. "Marcia is the real leader of this company. She's the one who has been holding everything together when no one else was looking, and it's time we recognized her for it." The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were used to hearing about profits, expansion, and growth, but they weren't used to hearing about the human side of the business. And yet, Jackson knew that this was the truth they needed to hear. Marcia has built this company's foundation, not through titles or promotions, but through trust, loyalty, and a genuine care for the people around her, he continued. "And if we want to move forward, if we want to build a sustainable future for this company, we need to start recognizing the value of leadership that's about more than just numbers." A new direction for the company. Jackson's revelation marked a turning point for harmonics learning. He knew that in order to create a culture that truly valued its employees, changes had to be made. He couldn't continue to run the company the way he had been. The focus on profits, while important, needed to be balanced with a greater emphasis on employee well-being, integrity, and leadership that listened to the voices of those on the front lines. "We are going to start with a new culture," Jackson declared. "A culture where employees are recognized not just for their performance, but for their dedication, their integrity, and their humanity. We will begin implementing regular employee recognition programs. We will prioritize leadership that listens and engages with employees at every level. We will create an environment where every person feels valued, where every voice is heard." The board, though initially resistant, began to see the logic in Jackson's words. The idea of creating a culture based on empathy, integrity, and recognition was something that had been missing from harmonics. And as Jackson laid out his plans for a new direction, one where Marcia's values of quiet leadership, support, and care were at the forefront, the board began to recognize that this was the future of the company. "From now on," Jackson said, "we will be building a company that is not just successful in terms of profits, but successful in terms of the people who work here. We will be a company that values trust, loyalty, and integrity as much as we value revenue and growth." The changes began immediately. Jackson implemented new policies that focused on employee well-being, and he made sure that every employee was recognized for their contributions, whether they worked in the boardroom or on the front lines. And as the culture began to shift, Jackson realized that this was the real transformation, the one that would truly change the future of harmonics learning. Conclusion. As Jackson looked out over the company he had built, he knew that he had made the right decision. The future of harmonics learning wasn't in the hands of loud, self-important leaders like Dylan. It was in the hands of the quiet, steady leaders like Marcia, who had been the true heart of the company all along. And as he took the first steps toward building a new culture, one rooted in empathy, trust, and recognition, Jackson knew that the real success of harmonics wasn't measured in numbers, but in the lives it touched and the people it inspired. As the dust settled from Jackson's pivotal decision to recognize the unsung leaders within his company, he was left to reflect on his own journey. The man who had once been solely focused on growth charts and profitability now understood that true leadership transcended numbers and metrics. Jackson Harmon had begun to see beyond the titles, the suits, and the polished presentations that once defined success in his eyes. He had come to realize that the essence of leadership was not about wielding power, but about inspiring trust, showing empathy, and taking responsibility for those who depend on you. In this quiet moment of reflection, Jackson felt the weight of his personal growth and the profound impact it would have on the future of harmonics learning. Jackson's personal growth. Jackson had always prided himself on being a numbers-driven CEO. From the moment he took over harmonics learning, his focus was on expansion, revenue, and the bottom line. He was driven by an unwavering belief that success was measured by growth, market share, and profitability. But his time undercover, disguised as Jack Morris, had shattered that belief, revealing the glaring truth that the true pillars of success were not the spreadsheets or the graphs, but the people who made the company run. The journey Jackson embarked on during the retreat was not just about understanding the needs of his employees, but about confronting his own shortcomings as a leader. He had always thought that leadership was about making tough decisions, holding the reins, and being in control. What he had failed to see was that true leadership was about empathy, listening, and empowering those who had the power to drive the company forward. His blind pursuit of external success had left him disconnected from the very people who made that success possible. The realization that his leadership had been inadequate, despite his apparent success, was a humbling one. His transformation was not about becoming a perfect leader overnight. Instead, it was about understanding that leadership is an ongoing journey, one that requires constant self-reflection, vulnerability, and a willingness to adapt. Jackson recognized that leadership is not about titles or authority. It is about earning the respect and trust of those around you. By listening to his employees, understanding their struggles, and recognizing their contributions, Jackson was finally on the path to becoming the kind of leader who inspires loyalty and fosters a thriving culture. The impact of Marcia's leadership. Marcia Quinn had always been the quiet force behind harmonics learning. She never sought recognition or praise, yet she had single-handedly held the company together during its toughest times. Jackson's decision to promote her to a leadership role was not just a reward for her years of dedicated service. It was a statement to the entire company about what true leadership looked like. Marcia's leadership wasn't flashy or loud, but it was steady, compassionate, and rooted in integrity. She wasn't the one in the spotlight, but she was the one everyone turned to when things got tough. She had earned the trust of her colleagues through her selflessness, her ability to step in when needed, and her unwavering commitment to the company's values. Promoting Marcia was a powerful message to the employees at Harmonics Learning. Leadership doesn't come from titles, but from the ability to inspire others, to care for them, and to lead by example. For Jackson, promoting Marcia was more than just a decision. It was a revelation. It was his way of acknowledging that the real leaders were often the ones who didn't seek attention, the ones who quietly made a difference every day. And by recognizing Marcia's contributions, Jackson was signaling a shift in the company's culture, a shift away from ego-driven leadership to one rooted in humility, empathy, and mutual respect. As Jackson looked toward the future, he couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. His journey of self-discovery and transformation was just beginning. There was still so much to learn about what it truly meant to lead, and he knew that harmonics learning was only at the start of its own transformation. The changes he had implemented were just the first steps in creating a company culture that valued people over profits, integrity over metrics. Jackson also realized that he had only scratched the surface when it came to uncovering the hidden heroes within his company. Marcia was just one example of the quiet leadership that had been quietly shaping Harmonix for years. Who else, he wondered, had been working behind the scenes, unnoticed, but instrumental in the company's success? Jackson was determined to find out. His journey of discovery wasn't over, and he knew that there were more unsung heroes waiting to be recognized. As Jackson sat in his office, staring out at the city skyline, he realized that the true measure of a leader wasn't found in boardrooms or quarterly reports. It was found in the way you treat the people who depend on you. His transformation was a work in progress, but he was committed to becoming the kind of leader who inspired trust, loyalty, and respect. And as he continued his journey, he knew that the company would follow. But there was still so much more to come. The changes Jackson had made were just the beginning, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges, growth, and discoveries. He had made the decision to listen, to lead with integrity, and to put the well-being of his employees first. But as the company continued to evolve, Jackson knew that he would face new challenges that would test his leadership in ways he could never have imagined. In the next episode, Jackson will face even bigger decisions, and he will uncover more about the people who make Harmonix learning truly great. Will he be able to implement lasting change? Will the board fully embrace the new direction? And what other unsung leaders will he discover along the way? Stay tuned to see how Jackson's journey continues to unfold and how his transformation will shape the future of the company. Jackson's realization wasn't just about understanding the importance of leadership. It was about understanding the very essence of what it means to truly lead. And that realization, he knew, would shape the future of Harmonix learning in ways he never imagined.